בוקר טוב. בוקר טוב וברוכים הבאים לעוד כנס של ישרא. יהיה פה צפוף עוד מעט, אנשים מתקשים להגיע למצוא את המקום, אז אני מקווה שהכניסות התקופות לא יפריעו מדי. באופן עקרוני אנחנו אמורים להיות מלאים עד 0 מקום על פי הרשמה. זה האירוע השני שישרא עושה יחד עם פרופסור מרק זלצר. אתמול התקיים אירוע עם מטה השיקום וכל רכזות השיקום ורכזות המשנה בנושא שילוב קהילתי, ואירוע שיותר מצומצם, יותר אינטימי ויותר אירוע עומק. היום אנחנו רק נתאם, תהיה הרצאה מרכזית ואחר כך סדנה, ובכלל אתם ראיתם כולכם את סדר יום. יש לנו יום מאוד 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 גדוש. אני הלילה חלמתי שאני צריכה להגיע לכנס ואני צריכה להרצות על נושא שאין לי מושג בו, ואני נורא בלחץ ואני לא יכולתי לישון יותר, וזה כל הזמן לא ידעתי מה הנושא, לא התכוננתי, לא ידעתי, ואמרתי, ולמה אני חולמת את זה? אני הולכת היום לכנס ואני לא צריכה להרצות אני רק צריכה לברך. אז אחר כך, ואז התבהר לי ואמר לי שאנחנו עשינו שינויים מאוד גדולים בקידום, התקדמנו מאוד מאוד בנושא השיקום בשנים האחרונות, מאוד התעמקנו בהחלמה, אבל אם אנחנו נעשה חשבון נפש, עוד לא מספיק התקדמנו בשילוב קהילתי אמיתי. אז אני לא רוצה להגיד שאין לנו מושג בנושא הזה, אבל יש לנו עוד הרבה מה ללמוד, ואני מקווה שהיום הזה יכול לתרום ללמידה הזאת. אז כמו שאני אמרתי, זה פרופסור זלצר איתנו כבר שבוע בחיפה, אתמול עם מטה השיקום של משרד הבריאות, מחר באוניברסיטה העברית, והיום איתנו. אז אני מאחלת יום פורה לכולם. אני מקווה שאנחנו מתחילים היום שוב משהו חדש, ואני מבקשת לפתוח בברכות מדוקטור גדי לובין, ראש שירותי בריאות הנפש. תודה.
שלום, פרופסור זלצר, אורחים נכבדים. קודם כל, אני מודה לכם שהזמנתם אותי לכאן. מודה לך, סילביה, את יצרת איתי קשר. ובהמשך ישיר למבוכה הקלה שסילביה שיתפה אותנו בה לגבי ברכות, מה בדיוק. אז יש לי כמה גילויים נאותים. א', בכל מה שקשור לעניין האישי שלי, סילביה שאלה אותי, כן לברך אותך כאן על מינוי לתפקיד אחר או לא, ביקש ממנה שלא, לפני שיש דברים שאני צריך לסגור עם המנכ"ל של המשרד, ובכל זאת קשור גם האם וגם במידה רבה מתי. אז אני זה שביקש מסילביה להימנע מזה. משהו שבכל זאת קצת יותר חשוב, זה בכנות חוסר ידיעה והיכרות מעמיקה שלי עם רגישויות מסוימות שיש בדיאלוג של הארגון הזה והגוף שאני אחראי עליו. בהבנה הפשטנית שלי, הקיום של ישרא מהווה, והפעילות כמובן, מהווה נדבך חשוב בהפיכת עולם השיקום לעולם שהתבנית של העשייה בו, המודלים של העשייה בו ברמה הארגונית, יהיו מקבילים למודלים שמוכרים לי מעולמות תוכן אחרים, כמו פסיכיאטריה, איגוד הפסיכיאטריה. אנחנו לפעמים עובדים, בדרך כלל עובדים מאוד בצמוד, בדיאלוג מתמיד. בדרך כלל גם מסכימים, לפעמים בקלות, לפעמים לא בקלות, ולפעמים גם מסכימים לא להסכים, זה בסדר גמור. המתחים האלה הם מצוינים. מזכיר לי איזושהי הברקה, נדמה לי זה היה גידי גוב, שמעתי לו פעם בראיון, שאלו אותו, תגיד, אתה לא קצת מוטרד מזה של כל יום שני וחמישי קם איזשהו כוכב, איזה זמר מצליח אחר במדינה הקטנה הזו, פעם זה כוכב נולד, פעם זה כוכב עולה, פעם זה השד יודע מה, נהיה פה צפוף. אז התשובה שלו הייתה, אל תדאג, המקום הזה מספיק קטן, ככה שיש מספיק ספייס לכולם. וזה נכון, זה יפה. קטן במובן של אינטימיות. זה טוב בהרבה ממציאות שהכרתי בכמה מפגשים שהיו לי. אחד מהם הוא מפגש שחזרתי ממנו אתמול בבוקר. יומיים שלושה של עבודה בפורום של עולם בריאות הנפש של מדינות דרום-מזרח אירופה, בלקן פלוס. והמאפיין הגדול ביותר, הבולט ביותר שם, זה איזושהי סטגנציה, איזשהו קיבעון, שמקורו לא רק במגבלות תקציב, אלא גם בגלל איזושהי מנטליות, כפי שהם מציגים את זה, של היעדר יוזמה. אף אחד לא ממש מחפש רעיונות, ואם מישהו חושב שצריך לשפר במשהו, הוא קצת נתקע, וגם האמירה של אנשים שכבר מנסים לעשות משהו, שהרפלקס הראשוני הוא רפלקס של, אם כבר משהו מנסה להיוולד, הרפלקס העיקרי הוא רפלקס של עדיפה. מכל מיני סוגים, יכול להיות אידיאולוגיה, יכול להיות תקציב, ובסופו של דבר יש משהו שהוא קבוע, מים שקטים מאוד. וזה לא דומה בשום דבר למציאות שאני מכיר כאן, שהמוחות קודחים וחדשות לבקרים צצים רעיונות נוספים בכל מה שקשור למודלים בשיקום, לשינויים ארגוניים כאלה ואחרים. זה מצב יותר בריא. ולמצב היותר בריא הזה אני חושב שאתם שאתם תורמים נכבדים לו. ועל כך גם התודה, גם הערכה שלי, ובעיקר, חשוב יותר, אני משוכנע, נתרמים מכך המתמודדים עצמם. לסיום הדברים האלו, אני הייתי רוצה להתייחס לכמה תהליכים, לעדכן אתכם בכמה תהליכים שקורים, כמה דילמות שאנחנו נמצאים, אתגרים שאנחנו מתמודדים עימם ברמת המשרד והאגף. האחד, אתם יודעים, מימוש הרפורמה הלכה למעשה. אנחנו מדברים על שנה שבה כבר הוקמו קרוב ל-30 מרפאות על ידי קופות החולים. רק בשבוע שעבר נפתחו 13 מרפאות של קופת חולים מכבי, מאפס. מכבי לא היו מרפאות. זאת אומרת, מה שהיה איזשהו מאמץ שרץ לאורך שנים ברמת מסעים ומתנים בין חשבים, רואי חשבון, עורכי דין ואנשי מקצוע, היום כבר מתחיל לקבל ביטויים מוחשים בשטח, וזה לפחות ברמה אישית מעורר, גורם הרבה מאוד סיפוק. ביומיים שלושה מאז נפתחו 3 מרפאות בצפון, יש פניות של לא פחות מאשר 60 הורים לילדים שזקוקים לסיוע ולא היה להם שום דבר זמין באמת. זה ממש כמו איזושהי אדמה צחיחה שרק חיכתה לגשם, והגשם הגיע. והנה סוף סוף דברים פרקטיים, מעשיים קורים. זה אומר שגם לכם לא להתייאש מניירות, לא להתייאש לפעמים מתהליכים שנראים סיזיפיים ומתסכלים. בסוף דברים קורים. זה לקח רק 20 שנה. אני מתחיל לספור בתור בירור ממלכתי, כמעט 20 שנה. ודבר אחרון שאני מוצא את עצמי יותר ויותר עסוק בו, והייתי רוצה לשתף אתכם באתגר, זה הניסיון להתמודד עם איזושהי מציאות שבהתחלה קצת לא מובנת. והיא בכל רגע נתון, ברוב אזורי הארץ, אני אומר באופן פשטני, יכול להיות שבנקודתית יש מה שאני אומר לא יהיה רלוונטי עבור. כשאנחנו מחפשים על פתרונות לאנשים, פתרונות שכוללים דיור, יש מקומות פנויים, מסגרות שיש בהם אנשים שיכולים, בשיקום, שיכולים לקלוט אנשים, גם מבתי חולים. יש את המיטות, יש את החדרים, יש את הארגונים. ובתי החולים מצידם נמצאים במעל 100% תפוסה, מתחילים לפעמים, זה מגיע עד רמת לעתים הוספת מזרונים לכמעט מסדרונות. זה לכאורה לא מתכנס. אם שם אפשר, ושם יש מציאות מאוד לא טובה בכל מה שקשור לתפוסות ועומסים, על כל המשמעויות של זה, כן? בכל מה שקשור לרווחת הפרט, ליכולת לטפל, ליכולת להגיע להישגים. משהו פה לא מתכנס. ועם המשהו הזה אנחנו כעת מתמודדים. הדבר האחד שאנחנו מנסים לייצר זה מודל בסיסי יותר של שיקום בקהילה. בסיסי יותר גם מההוסטל הכוללני. אנחנו עסוקים באפיון מסגרות כאלו, כי זה חלק מהמענה. נקודה אחרת שלדעתי אנחנו די בתחילת, יש עוד הרבה מה לעשות, אני רוצה להגיד בתחילת המאמץ, זה להתייחס ברצינות לאתגר הגדול של השיקום עדיין בתוך האשפוז. שיקום, לא טיפול, שיקום כהכנה לשיקום בקהילה. יש מודלים שאנחנו עסוקים בפיתוח שלהם היום. ההתרשמות שלי זה שאנחנו יכולים לעשות שם יותר, כדי לצמצם את לכאורה האנומליה הזאת, ולייצר מעברים ודיאלוג יותר נכון בין עולם האשפוז ובין עולם בקהילה. וגם במידה מסוימת, במקומות מסוימים, להרחיב בצניעות ובזהירות את מספר המיטות, כי יש בוודאי תחומים מסוימים שהוזנחו, ושאנחנו חייבים בתגבור של היקף המיטות עבורם. נדבר על מי שסובל בהפרעות אכילה, מצבים מסכני חיים, שאנחנו כעת בבעיה שם, והרחבנו את היקף המיטות. נדבר על קטינים, גיל הרך, בעיה משמעותית, נוער, ובאזורים מסוימים גם מיטות אקוטיות רגילות. אבל המשוואה הזאת היא משוואה מאוד מורכבת, עם הרבה מאוד משתנים. וצריך להתמודד עם כל אחד מבין המרכיבים באותו פסיפס שמייצר את אותה מציאות שתיארתי בהתחלה, שלכאורה אפשרי, לכאורה יש היכן, ומצד שני, מצב שלעיתים מתואר על ידי מנהלי בתי החולים, ומבקרים בחלקם גם רואים את זה, כמצוקה מאוד קשה. הדבר הקל ביותר זה להיכנס למתחים, לבוא ולדבר על זה שהשיקום לא עושה את עבודתו מהזווית של בתי החולים, כי איך הם לא מקבלים את, ומבחינת השיקום, זה בית החולים לא עושה את עבודתו, כי איך הוא משחרר את במצב הזה והזה, בזה אנחנו טובים. טובים וטובעים. ובסוף זה מסוג הזוויות הראייה שאין בהם אין בו איזה צדק אחד, צריך להתחקות אחר המרכיבים שמייצרים את המציאות הזאת, ולפעמים את הביקורת, לדעתי הלא מוצדקת הזאת, מכל הצדדים, כדי להתמודד נכון עם האתגר הזה, כשליחי ציבור. כל אחד בסוג אחר של שליחות, אני במקום אחד, חלקכם במקום אחר, אבל כולנו מחויבים מקדישים את חיינו לאותה מטרה של יצירה של רווחה ואיכות חיים והחלמה וטיפול נאות ושיקום יפה של מי שזקוק לו. אני מודה לכם על ההקשבה, שוב על ההזמנה. I apologize, Professor Salzer, that I would be able to enjoy and to learn only part of your lecture, so I won't interrupt you. I'll sit over there near the exit and learn as much as I can. Thank you very much. תודה רבה לכם.
זה הזמן להודות לאכסניה, ובמיוחד לדוקטור רינה בינה, חברת ועד מנהל של איספרה, שעזרה לנו בקישור לאוניברסיטה. אז תודה רבה, ותודה רבה לכל העושים במלאכה, גם של האוניברסיטה. ואני מבקשת להזמין את פרופסור חיה יצחקי לברך. פרופסור חיה יצחקי היא ראש מגמת פיתוח קהילתי וארגוני בבית ספר לעבודה סוציאלית באוניברסיטה.
בוקר טוב לכולם. אני שמחה, באמת חבל שזה לא מלא, אבל אנחנו שמחים מאוד לארח אתכם כאן, ואני שמחה שהנושא שנבחר הוא הנושא של שילוב קהילתי. כל תוכנית ההפרטה שנעשתה במשרד הבריאות בעצם נבעה מתוך האוריינטציה שהנכה, המשוקם, החולה, מדברת בכלל באופן זה, צריך להיות בתוך המסגרת הקהילתית שלו. אני חושבת שזה עוד קצת מוקדם, למרות שמדובר בתהליך של 20 שנה, להתייחס למה קורה בתוך תהליכי ההפרטה. אני כן יכולה להגיד ממשרד אחר, ממשרד הרווחה, משרד הרווחה הפריט 92% מהשירותים שהוא נותן. זאת אומרת, רק 8% לא מופרטים. וזה כולל כמעט את כל המסגרות, כולל ילדים בסיכון, כולל מרכזי הגנה, כמעט הכל מופרט. וכשכחלון הפך להיות שר הרווחה, הוא קרא לי ולפרופסור יוסי קטן, זיכרונו לברכה, ואמר, תעזרו לנו להלאים חלק מהתוכניות שהפרטנו, ואני חשבתי שזה לא נכון. זאת אומרת, להלאים אחרי שהופרטו הדברים, זה לא נכון. השאלה, כמה המשרד באמת לוקח אחריות על תוכניות ההפרטה שנעשו, כמה הוא באמת מודע לכל מיני דברים שהתרחשו, כדי שלא יהיה מצב שמגיעים לאיזשהו מרכז, להוסטל או כל מרכז אחר, שנמצאים בו ילדים או נמצאים בו אחרים שהם לעתים קרובות חסרי אונים, ואז מסתבר שהם נפגעו מאלימות כזו או אחרת. אנחנו כל הזמן קוראים על זה בעיתון, וזה אסור שיקרה. אז נכון, אפשר לבוא ולהגיד, זה יכול להיות גם בתוכניות מולאמות, זאת אומרת, תוכניות בשילוט כזו או אחרת. עדיין, אני חושבת, תפקידו של המשרד, של כל משרד, להיות מאוד מאוד עם יד על הדופק של מה שקורה בכל התוכניות. וזה מביא אותי לנושא של השילוב הקהילתי. כי מבחינתי, ברגע שהתוכניות הופרטו, והלקוחות שלנו נמצאים בתוך הקהילה, אנחנו צריכים לעבוד עם הלקוחות ובמקביל לעבוד עם הסביבה של הלקוח, עם כל הסט הארגוני של הלקוח, שמצד אחד כולל את המשפחה ואת ההורים, מצד שני כולל את הארגון עצמו, ההתמודדות של הארגון, אבל לא פחות חשוב ולפעמים יותר חשוב, זה הכנת הקהילה שבתוכה נמצא ההוסטל או נמצאת כל אחת מהמסגרות. עכשיו שמדובר בבריאות הנפש, אני לא צריכה להגיד לכם, הוא מדובר לא שייך לכם, אבל בנערות בסיכון או בנערים בסיכון. אף אחד לא רוצה שכנות של שכנים שהם במצב הזה. אם אנחנו נכין נכון את הקהילות כדי לקלוט אותם, נמצא הרבה יותר מתנדבים, נמצא הרבה יותר שיתופי פעולה, ונראה לי, רוב המערכות שאני מכירה היום, לא עושות את זה נכון. זאת אומרת, זה בדיוק הקטע שלדעתי מפספס מאוד, ואני חושבת שאם היו חושבים מראש על שילוב קהילתי, מבחינתי שילוב קהילתי הוא שילוב של הלקוח בקהילה, ושילוב של הקהילה לקראת הלקוח, וכשהלקוח נמצא במקום. עכשיו, זה דורש מיומנות רחבה, זה דורש מיומנות רבה. אנחנו שינינו את התוכנית של מה שפעם קראנו לזה ניהול ועבודה קהילתית, שינינו את התוכנית לגמרי, והיום זה נקרא פיתוח ארגוני וקהילתי, ושינינו את התוכנית בדיוק מהמקום הזה. יש כל כך הרבה הפרטות היום במשרדי הממשלה השונים, שאני חושבת שהגיע הזמן, מדבר על רפורמה פה ורפורמה שם, והרפורמה זה שם מאוד יפה, אבל צריך לרפורמה להכניס גם הרבה מאוד רוח. וצריך להכניס בו גם הרבה מאוד מיומנויות מקצועיות. והרפורמה צריכה להיות מבוססת על ידע אינטרדיסציפלינרי. היא חייבת להיות הרבה יותר רחבה. ולכן, אני חושבת שהתוכנית החדשה שלנו, שהיא פיתוח ארגוני וקהילתי, היא תוכנית שמאפשרת, אני חושבת, לכל עובד סוציאלי, אצלנו זה עובדים סוציאליים, יש לנו עכשיו תוכנית גם ללא עובדים סוציאליים. ללמוד עוד משהו שעם זה הוא מעשיר את הלקוח שלו הרבה יותר, ובאמת באמת יאפשר שילוב קהילתי. אני רוצה לאחל לכם הרבה מאוד הצלחה, ושיהיה לכם יום גדוש ומלא ומעניין. בהצלחה.
נמצאת איתנו גם דוקטור ליאורה פינדלר, ראש מגמה שיקום ובריאות בבית ספר לעבודה סוציאלית, וגם מבקשת מליאורה לברך.
שלום ובוקר טוב לכולם. It's our honor to welcome Professor Salzer from Temple University in Philadelphia. Is this your first trip to Israel? Okay. You're welcome. זאת זכות עבורי לברך בכנס של האגודה לשיקום בריאות הנפש, וזו זכות גדולה עבור כולנו שהאגודה בחרה בבית ספר לעבודה סוציאלית בבר אילן כאכסניה לכנס הזה, ואני רוצה להודות במיוחד לדוקטור רינה בינה, מרצה במגמה הניהולית ובמגמה השיקומית, על כל המאמצים שלה, ומי כמוני? פיתוח ארגוני קהילתי, הנה אמרתי את זה טוב, על המאמצים הרבים שלה לקיום היום הזה. כמי שחיה ונושמת שיקום במשך הרבה עשרות של שנים, אני הייתי עדה במשך הרבה שנים לאופן שבו המודל הרפואי הכתיב את כל אופני הטיפול של אנשי מקצוע ולכל הפתרונות הדיפרנציאליים והסגרגטיביים בהקשרים תעסוקתיים ומשפחתיים. ההבחנה התוותה בעצם את כל התוכניות ולא היה בלתה. אבל לימים, בזכות הרבה אנשים שאני רואה אפילו פה בחדר, אני חושבת שהמגמה הזאת מאוד השתנתה, והיום ברור לכולנו שאנחנו מתייחסים לאדם כשלם, ואנחנו בונים על ממשקים של תעסוקה ושל ובגורים ובילוי שעות הפנאי, אבל בעיקר אנחנו נותנים ביטוי לרצון של האדם, למטרות שלו, לחלומות שלו ולשאיפות שלו, ואין ספק שבכנס הזה משתקפת ההתקדמות הזאת, ומבחינתנו כבית ספר, הכנס מבטא גם את הרעיון של שילוש המגמות שלנו ב-MA. יש ברית מאוד משמעותית בין שלוש המגמות, ובשל הביקוש הרב בנושא של בריאות הנפש, אנחנו הולכים ומרחיבים משנה לשנה את התכנים שלנו, תוך התייחסות גם לאדם, גם למשפחה וגם לקהילה הסובבת אותם. אני חושבת שהכנס הזה נותן לזה ביטוי, ומבחינה הזאת הוא ממשיך את החשיבה הזאת. באופן כנראה לא מקרי, קיבלתי אתמול אימייל מאמא שאני בקשר איתה הרבה שנים, והיא כתבה לי בהתרגשות שהיה רעיון עם הבן שלה בעיתון ידיעות אחרונות אתמול, ופורסם שיר שהוא כתב, שאני חושבת שהוא לא במקרה הגיע אתמול ועיקרה כרגע. המקום האחר בו אני עומד מבודד כמו אי בלב ים, השוני נחקק בי צרוב ועצוב, כך נולדתי ואין זו בושה, אבל כשאני מחבק ואני אהוב, אני יודע שהגעתי ליבשה. וככה אייל שחל בעצם סולל את הדרך לכל מה שיאמר בהמשך ביום הזה. שיהיה יום פורה ומהנה.
Mark, I'm going to introduce you, but I'm going to do it in Hebrew since you know what you do, okay? Okay. אז כמו שדוקטור פינדלר אמר, פרופסור מרק זלצר מאוניברסיטת טמפל בפילדלפיה, הוא ייסד שם ועומד בראש של המגמה לשיקום באוניברסיטה הזאת. הוא מכהן גם כחוקר ראשי ומנהל את המרכז למחקר והכשרה באוניברסיטה הזאת. המחקר שלו מתמקד בהסרת מחסומים ומכשולים ובשילוב קהילתי של אנשים עם מוגבלות פסיכיאטרית בכל תחומי החיים. פרופסור מרק זלצר.
Boker Tov. I don't expect much more from me than that. I did know more Hebrew when I was younger, but I've forgotten almost all of it, but it's coming back very slowly, so I have a couple of words that I pick up every once in a while, and I know how to read in PowerPoint, so I know exactly where I need to go. So I wanted to first say it's an honor to be here with my fellow psychiatric rehabilitation colleagues here in Israel. It's a pleasure to be here at Bar Ilan University as well. I have an old friend here. We're both getting older. Shlomo Kravitz was in Philadelphia, I think it was about 13 years ago, and I had the opportunity to meet with him and do some work with him and another colleague of ours, a guy named Don Delario, who Shlomo went to graduate school with at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So it was very good for me to be able to see Shlomo today. I wanted to start off by thanking many people who have been very generous in allowing me to come here and join you in Israel and talk about community integration, community inclusion, and community participation. And I should start by thanking the University of Haifa and the Department of Community Mental Health for providing significant support to help me come here. I was able to teach a course at the University of Haifa and participate in a wonderful cross-disability conference talking about community inclusion, which is very unusual in the United States for us to do that. So it was wonderful for us to be able to do that, for me to be able to participate in that kind of activity here. My good friend and colleague David Rowe, who is very well known in the United States, does wonderful work, and it really is a pleasure for me to have been able to be here and talk to David and share ideas, and I look forward to future collaborations with him. I also want to thank the Tauber Foundation and ISPRA for also supporting my time here. Many people have been very kind with their time, but I also wanted to recognize one other individual sitting here in the front row, Max Lachman, who I also had an opportunity to meet a number of years ago, and you know, anywhere, it doesn't matter what country they're in, when you meet a wise person, it's a very nice thing. So it's been wonderful to be able to spend more time with Max. My only worry, though, is he's going to hear me now. This will be going on his 8th hour or something, and I'm worried he's going to fall asleep or something, and I'm not going to take offense at this. So it's wonderful. One of the messages that I communicate, so I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist. In the United States, I like to say I'm licensed and dangerous. I've been trained in psychotherapy and to do those kinds of things. I've worked had worked in psychiatry departments for about 15 years before I went to Temple University. I liked working in psychiatry departments. I thought it was a very good experience. And I learned a little bit about how to think in that kind of way that psychiatrists think. And it's actually influenced my work in community integration. And one of the take-home messages from the research that I do and what I'll be presenting today is that community integration and community participation is medically necessary. The data that I'll be showing you today and some of the work that I've been doing documents that work, dating, going to school, going to university and college, voting and volunteering, going to church, synagogue, or mosque, leisure, recreation out in the community. This is as important for mental health and wellness, in my opinion, and I'm still doing the research to prove this, is as important as medications, as important as psychotherapy, as important as anything else we do in the mental health system that we call treatment. And that's one of the messages I'd like you to be thinking about and the kind of work that I've been doing. What I'll be talking about is, we all know community integration is important. Okay, I know we have very similar views about this. What I'll be doing, the first part of the presentation is sharing you some of the data from the United States that will depress you about the current state of community participation of individuals with psychiatric disabilities. Then I'll show you evidence that people with psychiatric disabilities would, could, and should participate in the community like everyone else. And there's a reason I think that it's important for me to share this data with you. I'll offer a framework for understanding how to promote and think about community integration. And finally, I'll end this presentation by talking about some of the challenges that we have in psychiatric rehabilitation services for promoting community integration, things that I think it would be important for us to think about for promoting community participation. So let me start by having us think about a story, okay? About 10 years ago now, in Pennsylvania where I live, there was a lot of effort to train and hire peers to provide peer support in the mental health system. And there are many initiatives to promote peer support in Pennsylvania and actually across the United States. And as part of this initiative, we felt it was important, the partners I was working with to promote peer support, we thought it was important to prepare the environment, prepare the mental health system for peers, okay? And one of the ideas that I had is that if providers and policymakers didn't have the right stories in their heads, the original term stereotype, social psychologists in here know the word stereotypes. Traditionally, we study stereotypes with what are called trait adjectives. I don't know how that translates into Hebrew, but lazy, poor, tall, short, descriptive terms. But the original concept of stereotypes was developed by a journalist named Walter Lippmann in the 1920s, and it actually means pictures in our heads. So I was interested in the pictures in our heads. I interpreted as stories about people with psychiatric disabilities, that these pictures would be important for our understanding of our ability to promote and have authentic peer support in our mental health services. So what I did is I asked some providers in the mental health system in Pennsylvania and some policymakers to write down some stories in response to this prompt. I understand psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychology is very big here, so this is my projective technique, right? And I asked these people to think of a story about a man named John who is 38 years old and has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Your story can include anything about how John thinks, feels, or behaves. The story should have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Start your story with once upon a time. Okay, and my view was the type of story that we tell as providers, as policymakers, will give us a hint about our openness to not only peer support, but our openness to meaningful community participation for people with psychiatric disabilities. So when we analyzed these stories, we found two basic types of stories that providers and policymakers told. The first type of story is one that's probably very familiar to many of us, right? This is the story that we started calling the John the Patient story. And this story went like this. John was released from the hospital. John got a room at the YMCA. Once a month, he would get a phone call from his caseworker. John would spend most of the day sitting in his room. John was afraid to go outside as he felt people were looking at him or talking about him. When John was in the hospital, he sometimes felt the same way, but not always. At the hospital, they gave him pills, and there were people who talked to him. Sometimes this made him feel better. John had doctor appointments once a month at the clinic. Sometimes he would go, sometimes he wouldn't because he forgot. They would also give him pills, which he would take sometimes, but other times he would forget or he couldn't find them. John thought people were breaking into his room and stealing them. As John got lonelier and more scared, he just stayed in his room. He didn't bathe or shave or wash his clothes. When he did leave his room, people would point and talk about him because he was dirty and smelled. One day, John went out, and when people started pointing at him, he yelled at them and threatened them. They called the police, who arrested him. After a few days in jail, John had a hearing and was sent back to the hospital. This made John feel better. He once again had people who cared about him. So I typically ask people what they see in these stories, but I'm going to go quickly. You'll see I'll start talking very fast at the end of the presentation to cover everything. But this kind of story talks about, I call it John the Patient. It's focused on symptoms, right? Diagnosis, hospitalizations, John's getting worse, things happen, he goes to jail, he goes to the hospital, all these kinds of things. It's focused on John as an illness, right? John is a patient, John is a schizophrenic, right? He's a schizophrenic. My hypothesis is people who tell these stories is first of all, this is not an untrue story, right? I've worked in locked acute psychiatric units for 2 years in my career. I know this story, right? I actually used to write notes in clinical records, chart notes, just like this. Okay, I know this story. People who tell this as the first story I hypothesize are people who will have challenges promoting community integration. It'll be a little hard because they're seeing John as ill, as deficient, as defective in some way. That's all who John is. He's sick, he's defective, we need to fix John. Okay? John the Patient story. The other type of story that people told, I refer to as John the Person story. Okay? John lived in his country home with his parents and 3 older siblings. As the youngest child with 3 older sisters, he was the center of his family's attention for many years and enjoyed being the focus of their lives. He was not at all thrilled with the idea of leaving this nurturing environment to enter school, where other children often made fun of him and teased him, but he did. His high school years weren't especially enjoyable, so he was excited about the opportunity to begin working at the local McDonald's after graduation. John is not very interested in talking about the time of high school graduation until now, saying that it has been a very difficult struggle, one in which he watched both of his parents die of cancer within 2 years of each other, and his other 3 sisters become further distant in his life. He talks briefly about receiving a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the many doctors, counselors, and hospitals, all of which had different labels and treatments for the problems he kept finding himself in, but he prefers now to focus on his new 1-room apartment that he just moved to, and the fact that he is the short-order cook at the local Friendly's, a restaurant, working 15 hours a week. John thinks about asking Mary, a waitress, on a date, going to his sister's home for Memorial Day picnic, and saving enough money to buy a cassette player. John is a 38-year-old man who dreams about finding a girlfriend, working more hours, managing his finances, seeing his sisters more, and keeping his current apartment. I always smile at the part about asking waitress Mary on a date. I also worked at a restaurant when I was 14 years old, and there was a waitress who was 18, and I thought she was beautiful, and I was the guy who mopped the floors and cleaned the dishes. And I smiled because, I had no chance. But one day I had mopped the floors, and she was walking on the floor, and she slipped, and I caught her. One of the best days of my life. Don't tell my wife that I say this. But, I understand. I connected with this story, right? I know John. John is, kind of like me in a lot of ways. He's had different experiences. I've never been diagnosed with schizophrenia. I haven't had some of those things. But John's hopes, dreams, and desires, I understand, right? If I tell this type of story, when somebody asks me about John, this does not deny illness, right? John has an illness, right? Doesn't deny pills and treatment, but John is a person like everyone else. And if we think about this kind of story, if this is what comes to our mind, we're going to have do a better job understanding community integration, why it's important, and also what the outcome is that we're looking for. Okay? We're looking for this. Self-esteem is a good thing, but work is community integration. Quality of life is a good thing, but dating is community integration, right? Living in housing in the community, going to church, synagogue, or mosque, if that's important to you, that's community integration. That's the goal that we're shooting for. Some of these other things, great, but it's community integration that we're looking for. Community integration, I like to say that everything I know comes from two sources. First of all, it comes from people with psychiatric disabilities. I learn everything I know from people, listening to people, what's important in their lives. I also know a lot from the intellectual and developmental disabilities community, where they've been talking about community integration for 60 years. Okay? In the US and in our mental health systems, it's kind of a new concept to us, but they've been talking about it for a long, long time. Started with the normalization movement in Denmark. The goal of the normalization movement was to create an existence for the mentally retarded as close to normal living conditions as possible. Okay? The normalization movement evolved into what's called social role valorization. How many of you have ever heard these things? Normalization, there's some IDD people who are going, yeah, you know, Mark, I'm glad we're talking about this now. Social role valorization, a guy named Wolfensberger started writing about this. The basic idea is that we need to create, support, and defend valued social roles for people at risk for devaluation. He was primarily talking about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, mental retardation, but it can certainly be applied to many social groups. Okay? His argument that I buy, that I agree with, is that people who are not engaged in valued social roles, work is valued by all of us, by society, education, spirituality and religion, dating, parenting, friendships, leisure recreation, citizenship. Okay? People who are not engaged in valued social roles are devalued by society. Okay? We treat them as different. We call them different names. We view them as lesser than human. We view them as patients, right? They're different, they're other, they're not like us. Okay? And there are all sorts of implications that allows us to do things and allow things to happen in their lives because they're less than human. So there was a big movement in the US and other places to do something about these valued social roles, to increase opportunities for people to participate in the community like everybody else. And there are some other well-known people who write in this area. John O'Brien is one of them. So I use different words, and I'll try to define them a little bit now. I use community integration, community inclusion, and community participation. Okay? When I first came here, or was talking about coming here, I asked people were using the word community inclusion or social inclusion, right? I said, what word do you use? It said community inclusion. I said, well, that's interesting because in the US we use community integration. And here's what community integration is, at least in US laws and policy. First of all, I have a definition. It's the opportunity to live in the community and be valued for one's uniquenesses and abilities like everyone else. So it's really focused on opportunity to work and go to school and to date and to parent and do all these kinds of things like everyone else. It's based in the US. We have our Americans with Disabilities Act that provides this right for people with disabilities to live in the community like everybody else. That's community integration. We had a Supreme Court Olmstead decision that said that this right also applies to people with psychiatric disabilities. There were some questions over the decades in the US. The different disability communities have not talked to each other very well, especially psychiatric disabilities. They were kind of excluded. And there was an argument that the Americans with Disabilities Act did not apply to people with psychiatric disabilities, and the Olmstead decision said, yes, it applies to people with psychiatric disabilities. The notion of community integration is consistent with the idea of accommodations, right? So in the US, some of the big accommodations for people with physical disabilities, physical impairments, are ramps. So this stage would not be ADA compliant, Americans with Disabilities Act compliant, because if I happen to utilize a wheelchair, how the heck am I going to get up here? I'd probably have to have 2 big guys, 3 big guys, maybe 4, carry my wheelchair up there. That's embarrassing, right? That's, you know, I have to be helped like that. I should be able to do the ramp, get up there. Curb cuts. We have our curb cuts on our streets, onto our sidewalks. I've actually noticed the curb cuts here in Tel Aviv. And in Haifa, there are curb cuts, but it's still, it leaves, it's not ADA compliant. It still is not, it's too difficult. So that's opportunity of accommodation, okay? We create more opportunities for people to live in the community like everybody else. We do a good job with physical disabilities, a fairly good job for people with sensory disabilities, hearing impairments, visual impairments. Psychiatric disabilities is another story. The issue of accommodation, though, is, yeah, okay, we'll allow you to be here. We think you have a right to be able to work, you know, work in a place. It's, you know, we'll make a place for you, okay? But that's different from community inclusion, which when I'm reading, community inclusion is something that people in Europe primarily are writing about in this kind of way. This is not a very US concept, so we don't use this. Community inclusion means actively working to bring people who have historically been excluded to come in. It's actively welcoming, seeking people out. We want you here at our workplace because you bring unique knowledge and abilities. We want you here. We want you in our universities because you bring unique perspectives on the world that are important for all of us to hear. This is community inclusion, okay? Actively seeking people out. When I think about it, I think this is not something in the US we would do because somebody would call it socialist and it would never get accepted, right? Socialists, we can never do this, you know, but I think that this is a nice goal. Every once in a while we do things that are more welcoming, right? We seek people to come in. Recently, our federal Department of Labor initiated a policy where anybody who wants a federal contract with the US government has to have 7% of their workforce with a disability, with a documented disability. This is an example of inclusion. This is more than, okay, yeah, we'll give you a spot. This is like, we want you, you know, we want you here. And it's a policy to promote inclusion. So we do this every once in a while in the US. I just try to, you know, hide it so it doesn't sound like socialism or something like that. They'll start calling it Obamacare and then, you know, nobody will want it. So community inclusion. When I talk about community inclusion, some of my colleagues in the US, provider and policy colleagues say, well, yeah, we've done a good job with community integration. We have more people living in the community. They're not in institutions, they live in the community. These are some data. These are the number of people who were in psychiatric institutions, in asylums, in 1969 to 2011. 1969, there were about 370,000 people in institutions across the country. Okay? In 2011, there were around 41,000 people in institutions. So yes, we've done a good job in decreasing the number of people in institutions, more people in the community, but that number for some of us should be 0. And we have data indicating that people living in the community, it's cheaper and it's associated with better quality of life. Cheaper even for people with very, very significant impairments. I tell you, I've worked in acute psychiatric locked units. I used to be that guy, I don't think you have him here, but that guy who when somebody gets out of control, I was the one to grab them and to, with a bunch of other guys, and shackle them on a bed. I would do this. I know what serious mental illness is all about. I've experienced it, and I think that number can be 0. Okay? I know these people. I know what's going on. So more people in the community, but people are not of the community like everyone else. Okay? Housing is different. We have some evidence. I'm not going to show it because I have to go faster. We have evidence that people with psychiatric disabilities are living in very densely concentrated areas, segregated areas of Philadelphia. There's an interest in psychiatric ghettoization. This is a study that our center funded where we documented modest levels of ghettoization, of segregation of people compared to other poor people. Okay? So even compared to other poor people, there was greater concentration. We know that people's employment is different from everybody else. They're the lowest, in the US, our data indicate that people with psychiatric disabilities have the lowest employment rate of any disability group. It's around 15% employment, okay? 50% employment typically for other disability groups. That's not a good thing, okay? People are more dependent on Social Security and entitlement. The largest group that gets Social Security entitlements in the US are people with psychiatric disabilities. About 40% who have receive entitlements have a psychiatric disability. They're also the group that's least likely to ever leave entitlements. About 1% who get entitlements ever stop getting entitlements. One of the challenges for us is we work very hard to get people on entitlements. In the US, if you stay on entitlements, it's about $11,000 a year. That's below the poverty level. It means if you never get off, you live a lifetime of poverty, and poverty stinks for everybody. Doesn't matter if you have a psychiatric disability or not. If you live in poverty, it's not a good thing. Educational attainment for people with psychiatric disabilities is lower than the general population. High school graduation rates are a little bit less than the general population. College graduation rates are much less than the general population of students. This is an area that I do a lot of work in because I think it's critical to careers. Education is one of the top 3 factors that predict employment outcomes for at least most Americans. I suspect it's the same factors here. Gender is a factor, a key factor that affects employment. In the US, it's race or ethnicity. African Americans, blacks, are employed less than whites. And educational attainment is another key factor. Those with college degrees work more, are employed at higher levels than the general population. We know people have smaller social networks, people with psychiatric disabilities, than the general population. We know that people report being more lonely and isolated than the general population. We know that people's social networks primarily consist of, at least in the US, us. We are part of their social networks. When we ask people who's important in your lives, they say us, right? And that might make us feel good. That's good therapeutic relationship. But that's not like everyone else, right? My people in my life, people who are important to me, they're not my providers, right? Not my physician or, they're not paid people, okay? That's not like everybody else, okay? There's issues around leisure and recreation. All these kinds of things are critical. College students aren't engaged on college campuses the same way as other people. I've done some research in this area demonstrating that. Not like everyone else. One of my favorite topics is parenting. It's a critical issue in people's lives. People with psychiatric disabilities, in the US at least, are as likely to be parents as the general population. Okay? It shouldn't be a surprise, just like everyone else. That's the other theme. Medically necessary, just like everyone else. Okay? This is another study that our center did. I don't know if this was part of the, I should probably say this in case any of my funders are here. We have a national center that's funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. Thankfully, we were just refunded for another 5 years. So this will be our 10th through 15th year of existence. Very honored to be able to have this. So if any of my program officers are here, I've given you proper credit for this work. This is a study where we looked at child welfare contact. I don't know if it's the same here, but if you have troubles as a parent, you come into contact with the child welfare system. That's any child welfare contact, and out-of-home placement means losing custody of your children. Take your children away. We looked at mothers with serious mental illnesses who were poor. We looked at mothers with other mental illnesses. So serious mental illness in the US is typically schizophrenia spectrum disorder, bipolar disorder, major depression, other mental illnesses, and then poor mothers who didn't have a mental illness. We found that mothers with serious mental illnesses, the 8% experienced out-of-home placement. They lost custody of their children compared to about 2% of other poor mothers. Poverty is one of the top factors that predicts custody loss. So 3 times more likely to lose custody of their children. The research in this area is very weak. We don't have a lot of data on the abuse rates or the neglect rates that lead to out-of-home placements. We need to do more work in this area. The research that does exist suggests that abuse rates, physical abuse, emotional abuse, whatever, is not necessarily higher for mothers with serious mental illness. There is a slight indication of higher rates of neglect, but these are things that we can provide supports for, right? And I would argue is the law is obligated for us to provide these supports. The reason this is important to me is I miss my children. All right, I've been gone usually after 2 nights. That 3rd night, when I'm somewhere, I'm traveling, I'm crying myself to sleep, and I'm probably on my 10th night. I don't even know what day it is. So I miss my children, right? 18, 16, 14 years old. Joshua, this is an old picture. They're bigger than that. Joshua, Benjamin, and Joseph. Good Old Testament names, right? So, children, this is important, right? It's the same thing for people with serious mental illnesses. I've had, in the US, children are used sometimes as coercion for people to be engaged in treatment. You take your pills, you get your children back, right? You participate in treatment, you get your children back. How can you talk about recovery and not pay attention to children, right? To somebody's children. This is very important for us to pay attention to. Some of those mothers who experience that coercion, they want nothing to do with the mental health system. I do not blame them, right? If you've had this experience, if you've had the experience of being shackled, I'm a bad guy, that's not a good thing. I'm going to stay away from the mental health system if you do that to me. So children are important. That's my Kelev. I just wanted to show pictures. That was another one. It's a Tennessee Coonhound is what we have. She's wonderful. That's Iris. So would, could, and should participate. When I talk about community integration with some of my colleagues, my psychiatric rehabilitation colleagues, my psychiatry colleagues, other people, policymakers throughout the US, they go, Mark, these people, it's part of the diagnosis, Mark. Come on. Schizophrenia? Anhedonia, you don't experience positive emotion, negative symptoms. You don't want to do things. You want to sit around your apartment or the day program, my clinical program. All you want to do is sit, drink coffee, smoke cigarettes, right? Watch TV, and die 25 years earlier, right? That's what these people want. It's part of the symptom. It's a diagnostic criteria even, right? People don't want to do these things. They don't want to work. They don't want to do these things. Bipolar disorder, it's probably a manic episode. You know, people don't want to do these things. Okay, Mark, even if they wanted to do these things, no way they could do these things, right? And thankfully, psychiatric rehabilitation, we found that we can support people in doing these things. So could and should. Mark, even if they want to do these things, even if they could do these things, they shouldn't do these things, right? I'm sure this translates, right? Shouldn't do these things. Why? Work is stressful. Who is not stressed at work? Look around and make sure your boss is not here. You should raise your hand if your boss is here. It's stressful. School is stressful. Parenting, I love my children. It's stressful, okay? Life is stressful. People with serious mental illnesses, they get stressed. Exacerbation of symptoms, right? Symptoms get worse. Symptoms get worse. Crisis, psychiatric crisis. Psychiatric crisis means hospitalization, right? We want to avoid hospitalization at all costs. That means no stress, right? It means no life. We're happy. Sit at home, watch TV, smoke your cigarettes, drink your coffee or soda or whatever it is, and die 25 years earlier, okay? The data are exactly the opposite of that, right? We have evidence people would do these things. In the US, when we do these surveys, we find that 70% of people say they want to work. The top 3 things that people say they want in their lives are a good place to live, a job, and intimate relationships. Okay? People want to date, people want intimacy, just like everyone else. Okay? These are, by the way, the top 3 things. If we were to do a survey in this room, these would be the top 3 things that all of us would put on our list, just like everyone else. The U.S., this is interesting for me, this is my first visit here. The U.S. is a very religious and spiritual country. It's very important. 80% of people say they're very or extremely religious. Doesn't matter who you are, 80%. That's the general population. All of our surveys, we find 80% of people with serious mental illnesses say they're very extremely religious, just like everyone else. They want to participate in religion and spirituality just like everyone else. Okay? Voting, everything, they want to participate just like everybody else. We shouldn't be surprised. I have to do research, though, to document that people are just like everybody else. It's, I was telling Susie earlier, I had to do a study once to show that people with serious mental illnesses, this is around the internet, I've done a lot of internet interventions, and reviewers, grant reviewers would come to me and they would write their reviews back, low score. These people, they don't want to use the internet. They can't use the internet. They're scared of the internet. They think it'll take over their brains or do something. So I have to do surveys to show that people with psychiatric disabilities have the same attitudes towards computers and the internet as the general population. You know, it's like a duh to me, but this is the kind of stuff we have to do, I think, to prove it. I'm going to skip that. Could participate, all right? We all know this. We have our evidence. We know that with our various evidence-based practices and emerging practices that we can support people to live independently in the community with supported housing, to work, to go to school, to be engaged in peer relationships. So we have some evidence. We need to do more in all these areas. We don't do enough in parenting, show that we can support people in being parents. We don't do enough to support people in religion and spirituality, to support people in leisure engagement, to support people in every other aspect of life, but you know, we'll be doing that. And we know people should participate. There still is not enough data, and I have to keep doing literature reviews to make sure I'm current, but there are 9 studies I found a couple of years ago showing that employment was good for people, right? Self-esteem, quality of life, associated with decreased hospitalizations, fewer symptoms. It's good for people, helps people with coping, those things. Education is good for people with serious mental illnesses. Friendships and marital relationships are good for people. Now for those I am a hardcore quantitative researcher, okay? I'm as skeptical as it gets. The challenge with this is correlational research, right? Why is this correlational research? We can't randomly assign people to marriage and not marriage, right? We can't do that. But this is good. It's convincing enough to me. It's in the right direction all the time. Parenting. The one study that I've been able to find, and maybe there are more, Carol Mowbray, a wonderful person, ahead of her time and died too early a number of years ago. She interviewed 24 mothers with serious mental illnesses, and 81% said that becoming a mother was a positive event in their lives. 81%. I thought, this is the one. This is the one where people with serious mental illnesses are different from everyone else, right? Because I'm thinking, for me, this is important. It's got to be important for everybody. Why isn't this 100%? Okay? And then I looked at the general literature. Sociologists love this kind of stuff. Couples who don't have children are happier, more satisfied with their lives than couples with children. So I didn't know what I was missing, having children. Apparently with the research, quality of life does go up when they're out of the house, and hopefully when they're done asking you for money. My oldest son is just starting university this year, this August, and you know, so he's asking for money, but he's a good boy, so this is good. So parenting. Maybe I'm frozen here. So parenting is one of them. All right, now we're going to see if I can do this without my PowerPoint, but let's see. And I made some changes to it, so I don't know what I did here. What was it? Yeah, it looks like it's frozen. So I'll do this one.
יש כאן איש טכני שיכול לעזור לנו?
גיא.
לא, של האוניברסיטה חשבתי. מה? אסקי? אולי בינתיים אנשים שיושבים על המדרגות, יש פה מקומות פנויים, לא הרבה אבל יש.
So let me, I do have my notes here. I do diverge a little bit later while this is coming back up. So parenting, people should participate like everyone else. Religion and spirituality, we have research showing that people should participate, that it's associated with enhanced hope, more inclusion, more participation with other people, and physical activity and leisure and recreation. The research indicates, oh great, now there's a login. Saying I need a password. Let's see. Oh, is that what it is? Let's see if this one opens. So people should participate. Okay, so that's some of the evidence of the medical necessity of community participation. So frameworks for promoting community participation. See, I shouldn't be so dependent on PowerPoint. And this one has a picture, so I think I need to show it. So don't start talking again. The frameworks for community participation. The first thing is it didn't like that parenting slide, apparently, or my Kelev. All right, so frameworks for promoting participation, community participation. The first thing to think about is 3 dimensions of participation. The first dimension is the participation institution-based or community-based? So when I talk about community participation, some of our psychiatric rehabilitation provider colleagues in the US say, oh yeah, we do leisure and recreation all the time. Wednesdays we have show a movie in the program at the agency, right? It's really nice. You do this here too, right? You show your movies, yeah. So it's really nice. We show great movies. We get popcorn and I don't know what you're eating. We're eating popcorn and chips and soda and all this kind of stuff. And they say, that's community participation. Mark, we do this stuff. We do this stuff. We've got it all set. Okay? I say, that's nice, but it's not community participation like everyone else. I do not go to a paid program, my healthcare provider, to watch movies. That's not where I go. Okay? I go to a movie theater to watch movies. Okay? When I take classes, I don't take an education class at my healthcare providers. I take it out in the community, like everyone else. Institution-based participation, community-based participation. They're all good. I would, don't stop showing the movies. But if we want to promote community integration, it has to be participation like everyone else. Out in the community, we need to figure out how to make that happen, how to support people on the outside. Staff-directed participation compared to person-directed participation. Mark, these movies we show? Yeah, well, yeah, okay, we picked the movie. So what? Or the fact that we do movies, that's okay. All the patients, they like this. They like us to do this kind of stuff. Staff-directed participation, even out in the community, versus person-directed participation. There was a center in Philadelphia that I'd gone to once, a very good psychiatric rehabilitation type center, and they went on certain trips, excursions as a group out in the community, and I knew that they did things. They went to an amusement park and I think a museum, okay? I knew that the people who ran the program, this is what they like to do. I knew that. Not all the consumers, not all the patients were interested in these activities, and we don't always ask them, okay? Person-directed participation, doing exactly what that individual wants, is participation more like everyone else. And then separation versus association. Separation. We've got our education class. Well, it's just for people with serious mental illnesses, right? We have our employment, but it's just for people with mental illnesses. They're together during the employment. Other things, just for people with serious mental illnesses, that is separation, okay? Doesn't allow for opportunities to interact with people who don't experience disabilities. Opportunities that promote association is participation more like everyone else. Interaction with people who don't experience disabilities. This does not mean that we don't allow people to associate, people with serious mental illnesses, to be with one another. It just means that we provide those opportunities for association. These big, I was telling people, we have a term, load and go. Load people up in a van, right? Put them in a big 10-person van and drive to whatever, for us it's a baseball game or movie theater, and then all those people, they shuffle in together and they all sit in their seats together. That's in the community, but that's not going to allow for association, okay? Everybody else around, they're going to see the van, the agency's name on the side of the van, and they're going to see all these people together walking around as a group. That's not going to promote association. And that's, we need to increase opportunities for that kind of association. Yeah, maybe, oops. Maybe it doesn't like me for some reason. I do have my computer. So the other thing that we need to pay attention to is give me a second. Maybe it doesn't like my English slides or something like that. The other thing we need to pay attention to is a new conceptualizations of disability. Okay, we're all familiar with the concept of individual model of social disability, individual model of disability and social model of disability. Is that a concept that's familiar to people? Now I can't read English. Individual model of disability. All right, you ready? I think we're figured out now. If my computer crashes, this is my fault, my problem. Individual model of disability refers to something that's inherent within the individual. Okay? Aran has schizophrenia. Aran is disabled. Okay? It's the schizophrenia that causes the disability. Aran can't work because he's disabled. I'm good. This is, I have my own computer, so. Yeah, this should work. Thank you for that. So Aran doesn't work because, you know, he has a disability. We need to fix Aran, right? We need to give him social skills training, teach him how to behave appropriately in a work environment. We need to fix him. We need to fix his executive functioning, his memory problems, his the way he solves problems, problem-solving therapy, all these things. Fix Aran. We need to fix the illness. Okay? That decreases the disability. The social model of disability views the lack of participation as resulting from a person-environment fit. An interaction between the uniquenesses of the person, the uniquenesses of Aran, in interaction with the environment. Okay? So it's not Aran that's disabled. It's the situation that leads to a disability. So sometimes I talk about people who experience psychiatric disabilities. I don't know how well that translates, but it's an experience. It's not that you're disabled. Okay? My favorite example of this is there's a gentleman named Fred Fries. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's a psychologist who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia. I was giving a presentation with him once, And he talked about one of his issues, well, one of his uniquenesses is he is uncomfortable looking people in the eyes when he interacts. It makes him very uncomfortable. He can't do this, right? He can't look at people in the eyes when they interact. Okay, he's like this. He'll look up briefly and I'll look down. Okay, we say we need to fix this. Fred, we need to fix you with our social skills training. We're going to keep working on it and working on it and working on it till you can look people in the eyes like everybody else, right? So you can be normal, right? All of us should be able to look people in the eyes. That's normal. Thank goodness Fred has the opportunity to work in environments. He works as a psychologist. Thank goodness, and a professor, thank goodness he has an opportunity to work in an environment that is accommodating, that is welcoming of his difference. They didn't require him to have social skills training and fix his problem, right? It was something about the environment that created an opportunity for him to work, okay? So from this social model of disability perspective, let's offer Fred some social skills training, okay? Nothing wrong with that. But if that doesn't work or Fred doesn't want it, right? It's not perfect. I've done social skills training before. It's an evidence-based practice. It's wonderful. But it doesn't fix everything. And if we wait, too, for the participation for Fred to be able to maintain eye contact, we'll never get him into work settings. So we can provide those supports, but we also can do something about the environment, right? We can create work settings that are more welcoming of people with differences. Differences in interaction, differences, maybe, I didn't do a good job grooming this morning, and maybe I didn't. Maybe my clothes are funny, but thankfully, hopefully you'll welcome me even with something different. The first day when I was teaching the class at the University of Haifa, I knew that people didn't wear ties very often here, but I wore my tie the first day. I took it off after about an hour, but thankfully the students didn't throw me out the door because I was different. Thankfully they accepted me. But person-environment fit means, sure, provide supports, address the impairment, but also work on the environment. Working on the environment is key, and it's one of our sets of competencies in psychiatric rehabilitation. It's what we're supposed to be doing. I don't think we do enough. We do not do enough addressing the environment. We fix the person, right? Individual model of disability, not social model of disability. Our competencies say social model of disability, but psych rehab in the US, we don't do it. Okay? And there are lots of examples of these interventions that we do. Oops, you don't need to see, I'm no longer connected to the internet at my hotel, so cut that off. So this is the International Classification of Health, Functioning, and Disease that was developed by the World Health Organization. I always ask this in the US, all over the place, how many people are familiar with this? I was hoping more people in Israel would be familiar with this. This is more popular in Europe, not very well known in the US. This is a new concept. It's not so new. It's 10, 11 years old now. This is a model of health and functioning. Okay? The middle rows are the things to pay most attention to right now. Health and functioning is viewed in 3 different areas. These are all aspects of health and functioning. Body function and structure. This is what we're typically used to, right? My brain doesn't work, my kidney doesn't work, my liver doesn't work, my bones are broken. That's body function and structure, okay? Interventions target body function and structure. It's a surgery, it's a cast, it's pills to fix our neurotransmitters, okay? That's body function and structure. That's important. Activity. Activities of daily living is typically how people think about it. These are very specific, discrete tasks or actions that people engage in. This is grooming behavior, cleaning the house, getting dressed in the morning, doing your finances, these kinds of things, ADLs, activities of daily living. This is, according to this model, an aspect of health and functioning combined, right? You can't separate them. Health and functioning go together. You can't look at them separately. And for the first time, this framework said participation is important and unique and separate from these other things. These are engagement, involvements in social situations, work, dating, going to school, parenting, spirituality, religion, leisure, recreation, community participation, okay? What this model says, traditionally, when we think about this stuff, we think first with Aran or Shoshana, who has bipolar disorder, we need to fix the illness. Once the illness is fixed, then we address the activities of daily living, making sure that they know how to dress and groom and brush their hair and take a shower so they don't stink, those kinds of things. Once we fix that, then we focus on participation, right? It's all one directional. In the US at least, we never got here, right? We never got here because our pills, these are not, they're good. Again, I used to do psychopharmacological research. These are great things. I've seen very amazing things happen, but there are residual symptoms that always happen. If we wait for symptoms to go away, we'll never get here, right? We'll never get here. I've seen programs that say, look, Shoshana, you cannot go out to work in the community until you're ready to go out. You need to be able to dress appropriately. We need to fix you, right? Then you'll be ready to go out in the community. We'll never get to participation. Sometimes, you know, you have colleagues who don't have mental illnesses, who don't always dress right. Maybe they didn't brush their teeth, something like that, right? We all have them. You don't have to, you know, do everything perfectly. Financing and budgeting, most US citizens are not good at doing their own budgets, right? We shouldn't expect people with serious mental illnesses to do it better than everybody else, right? So participation, we never get to it. The other nice thing about the ICF, about this model, is the research, not just serious mental illnesses, but all areas of healthcare. People who are participating with cancer, they're better. They do better with their activities and better health outcomes. You're working, you're engaged in meaningful activities. Participation is associated with better health. I showed you the data indicating that we know people can participate, can work with mental illnesses. You don't have to be symptom-free to work. We know people who are depressed at our jobs, right? I know people who who get a little manic sometimes with bipolar disorder. Certainly if they have a full-blown episode, it causes problems. But people do have, you know, manic episodes at work, but they can still work, they can still go to school, they can still date, still do other things. We can participate with problems in these areas. That's what the ICF shows, or that's the framework, and I think we have the research saying that it works. And then this part, environment affects health and functioning. Social model of disability, right? The environment affects disability. Okay, even with all my technical problems and all that, okay. I've been given the 10-minute warning. So what we do is we address supports, we provide supports, we do a good job. We understand that as psych rehab, what did I skip over? We do a good job as psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners. We know how to do this, right? We know about treatment, we know about psychoeducation, skills training, supported interventions. I say there's a whole group of interventions that support people to do these things. We know about peer support, right? So we understand support. We also know what we don't know or think about enough. We do talk about stigma. And we say we need to do something about stigma, public stigma, as well as self-stigma. First of all, doing something about self-stigma, it's a great thing. But it's more individual model of disability than social model of disability, right? I think it's important to do something. We see it in some of the research we do, but we need to do more about that public stigma. We need to get rid of that stuff. We can't keep fixing the person and helping somebody overcome that. People experience discrimination, behaviors that limits people. People experience disempowerment, lack of voice in their services. So one of the things I've heard about the basket, the process of the basket, is a committee, a psychiatric rehabilitation committee that works with the person to make decisions about what psychiatric rehabilitation services. That pause was, do I say this or do I not say this? Because you're all such wonderful hosts. My concern is, what do people feel when they go into this meeting where there's a lot of people in the room who are professionals, have high education, who are the experts? I'm not an expert, I'm just a lowly patient, right? Am I going to feel like I have voice in that situation? Even after I've gotten training, we've done this in the US. We teach self-advocacy. We do this, but my peer colleagues and I are concerned. That's not enough. You go into an environment where you're used to being voiceless, and with people, even providers who have been trained to support empowerment, it's very difficult. Poverty is a huge barrier to community integration. Transportation is related to that, is a huge barrier to community integration. These are things we need to do. In the US, we have state laws that also limit community participation. So legal rights are different in the United States. We have 50 different states, a lot of different laws limit the rights of people to vote, serve on a jury, hold public office. It can be used as grounds for divorce. It can be used as grounds for limiting your parental rights. Okay? These are external barriers that we need to do something about. I think at least 50%, this is a guess, a little bit of research, 50% of the reason people aren't participating, like everybody else, is the barriers. Okay, if we just focus on fixing Aran and Shoshana, it won't be enough. We won't be able to increase community participation. We need to do it, unfortunately, we need to do the barriers too. And it's part of our psychiatric rehabilitation competencies. I'll show you in a second. The stigma, it's even in us. Et tu, Brute. Julius Caesar getting killed by his friend, right? Stabbed in the back. We stab people in the backs. I include myself. I say we. I don't know what it is in Hebrew. Maybe I'll look to see if I can read it. I can't read without vowels. I'm like a third grader. And then I don't know what the words mean, so I'm like an infant. So the research, these are reviews of the research that's been done on mental health provider attitudes toward and beliefs about people with serious mental illnesses. The conclusion is the beliefs and attitudes of mental health care providers do not differ from those of the general population, or are even more negative in some cases. Et tu, Brute. This is us too. We need to do something about this. We can't just say it's them. It's us. We're part of them. And it's something that we need to think about and do something 24 hours a day. For those of you who are interested in understanding more about geographic exclusion, come to Hebrew University tomorrow, I think at 9 a.m., and I'll be presenting some of the data on geographic exclusion in the School of Social Work tomorrow, so I'm not going to do that today. So what are the challenges for community integration? For the challenges of community integration for all of us, for psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners. The first challenge is, to what extent has our recovery orientation and psychiatric rehabilitation interventions become the old wine in new bottles? Okay? Our colleague and a friend of mine, Larry Davidson, wrote about concerns that recovery was going to become old wine in new bottles. I'm a very optimistic person, I really am, but I'm much more cynical about this than Professor Davidson is. I'm very concerned that old wine has become new bottles. I'm very concerned that 20 years after Bill Anthony wrote about recovery in 1993, by the way, consumers were writing about it and talking about it well before Bill Anthony was, from Boston University. He's a wonderful person, but consumers, this was consumers talking about this. My concern is the focus on recovery has not led us to focus enough on community participation. We're happy with hope. Hope is a great thing, and it's very important for community participation. but it's not enough. I'll use it now. I'm looking at Max because he's going to hear this for the 80th time. My other Hebrew, lo maspik. Right? It's not enough. Okay? Focus on, it's a nice concept and we talk about these things. The other thing is it enough to add a few new processes and programs and say we're a recovery-oriented system? We add our IMR groups. RAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plans, are you using them yet? No, yes? Yes. This is all the rage. It's an evidence-based practice, first of all. You'll have to go learn about it. I'm not an expert in it. But I'll also say RAP is not enough. But people in the US, at least, programs are adding a couple things. Oh, and they hire a peer, right? They'll hire a peer, maybe 2, maybe 10. They say, oh, we're recovery-oriented. Maspik tov. That's good enough. Not enough. It's not enough. It has to be more than just a couple of little procedures or processes. Do our interventions typically focus on fixing the person and pay less attention to the environment? I would argue yes. Our evidence-based practices that we typically use, they're very good, they're effective, they work, but we're not targeting the environment, and the outcomes are not good enough, for me at least. Okay? And I'm an optimistic, happy guy, right? The second challenge our practices is understanding that our practices are good, but are they good enough? Supported employment. People are not working for many months with supported employment. Our best evidence-based practice in the US, it's about 4 months on average of work, maybe 6 months on average, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 extra dollars, 7,000 to 10,000 shekels additional a month, or a year. This is important for somebody who's very poor, but it doesn't get people out of poverty. I love supported employment, I love my friends who do it, but it's not enough. Education is important, doing things with the environment is important, supporting people and getting careers that they could get, I think. Supported housing, Phil Llanos and some other people are identifying that people are living in the community in housing, but they're not doing anything in the community. So I'm doing some research now to show that better integration, more participation leads to more stable housing and longer community tenure. Our shared decision making, for me, I'm very skeptical of it. I'll talk about self-directed care and give a critique of this. Our peer support, in Pennsylvania where I live, the state where I live, I think we have 6 million people in Pennsylvania. We have about 1,400 peers who have been taught to be peer specialists. This is a great thing, but they're going into environments that have no idea what to do with peers and what to do with peer support. And peers are being asked to do things that, in my opinion, peers should not be asked to do. They're not non-peer professionals. They bring something unique, and we're not valuing peers for their uniquenesses and abilities. We're saying, hey, great, we have a peer who's a case manager, and then the peer starts acting like a case manager. Like everybody, like non-peers. We don't want that. We want that uniqueness. It's not just peer and peer support. There needs to be something different. I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. Part of my work in this area is I've been very fortunate to be able to work with the consumer movement and in the area of peer support for almost 25 years now. And it's just fascinating what we've seen. These are good things that are happening, but I have a lot of concerns about what's happening with peer support in the US. The third challenge is, to what extent do we acknowledge and use our unique competencies that are required to promote full community integration? Psychiatric rehabilitation competencies are very unique in a lot of ways. Social work has some of the advocacy competencies, okay? I'm a clinical psychologist, but I was also trained in an area of community psychology that takes an ecological orientation to the work. So I understand the need to address community and neighborhoods and families. So we have these competencies in psychiatric rehabilitation that are very unique, but I think these are the things that we talk about, but we don't practice. We don't do this stuff very often. And I think that this is as important as anything else we're doing. Promoting self-determination is one of our competencies. It's not shared decision-making, self-determination, in my opinion. Self-determination is, and I'll talk about this in the workshop, people making decisions literally for themselves without undue influence, okay? You make a choice. I might think it's a bad choice, but it's your right to make a choice. It doesn't mean all choice is allowable. Somebody wants to kill themselves, we stop that. Somebody who wants to go outside with all their clothes off and run around the street when it's really cold and they might die of exposure, yes, we don't allow that, okay? But there are many, many other choices that people can make, even things that we think are bad choices that should be allowable. People should be allowed to make mistakes and learn from mistakes just like anyone else, okay? Assessment and goal setting that's focused on community living and participation outcomes. I want to take my medications more often. I want to go to my IMR group. I'm going to go 3 days a week. I'm going to, go to whatever other group. That's not goal setting. That's promoting community living and participation. Those are treatment goals. Okay? Community living and participation outcomes. Use of natural and peer supports. We get the peer support. The natural supports are unpaid supports. Those should be integrated in our services. I'll be talking about that at the workshop. Utilizing mainstream resources and settings. That's things outside the mental health system and the psych rehab system. That's private gyms, that's public libraries, that's the community centers. I've heard about Amiteen. I think it's wonderful, right? There are things we can do with Amiteen too, I think, but we can talk about that. That's one of our competencies. Identifying and addressing environmental barriers, our competencies, community resources, developing linkages with these mainstream resources. That's part of our job. Integrating these resources into our outcomes, into looking at work and going to school and all these things. Promoting natural supports, challenging discrimination situations. The research indicates that our May is Mental Health Month and our October whatever is Mental Health Week. Lo must speak, it's not changing public attitudes and stigma, okay? 365 days a week, a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's going to take that for us to do it. It's not a little public service campaign too, like a nice commercial. That doesn't do it. We need to do more than that, and it's part of our job. We need to do that if we're, in my opinion, competent psychiatric rehabilitation professionals. We need to, in our intervention and program models, we need to modify the environments to promote recovery. Yes, supported employment does do this to a limited extent. Supported education does too. I get it. I think we can do more. Systems competencies, addressing and stopping discrimination. These are right out of the competencies in psychiatric rehabilitation, and I'd like to challenge us to start using these competencies. Make sure we have them, and to use these competencies, because if we don't, the fear is we're not doing enough. We're setting people up. We're saying hope. We're saying recovery. We're saying live a high quality of life. But we're not doing anything about the lack of curb cuts, the lack of ramps, the lack of personal assistance, like people who experience physical disabilities, the lack of braille signs that we have all over the US, so people with visual impairments, the lack of elevators that announce floors, so you know which floor to get off if you have a visual impairment. It's setting people up. Okay? We say, hey, this is good, we're going to get you, but it's not going to be enough. We need to start implementing all these competencies. So what next? It's trying to talk about how we can do these things, the different principles that are associated with community integration, what can we do about these environmental barriers, and I have to say, and we'll talk about some of these in the workshop, I'll have to say and admit that by the end, you'll be saying, Mark, Loma, speak. I don't have all the answers. I haven't figured it out yet. We're still trying very hard. But we have a lot of work to do in this area. but I'm always excited to see what people come up with. So thank you very much. Toda.